So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nancy Hopkins. So Nancy got her PhD at Harvard studying the lambda repressor. She then did a short postdoc here at Cold Spring Harbor. And after Cold Spring Harbor, she was appointed to the newly formed Institute for Cancer Research at MIT. And at MIT, she was studying tumor viruses for a long period of time before switching to study zebrafish. And her lab developed the first technique to do large-scale insertional mutagenesis in a vertebrate. And this allowed Nancy's lab to clone the majority of genes that control development in zebrafish for the first time. And for this work, Nancy was elected to the National Academy of Sciences. And outside the lab, in addition to the absolutely terrific work that her lab did, outside of the lab, she has been a longtime advocate for women in science. At MIT, she co-chaired a commission on the status of female science faculty at MIT. And when this commission published their report about systematic differences in the amount of resources and office space and lab space that were allocated to male and female faculty, it was hugely influential, and it caused a lot of reforms to take place at MIT and at other institutions. And so for the past few days, there's been a meeting on gender diversity in biosciences at Banbury, and I asked Nancy if she would come talk to the Cold Spring Harbor community as well, and she kindly agreed. And so we're going to have a talk here, and then afterwards, there's going to be a reception and roundtable discussion where you'll have a chance to kind of talk more about some of these very important issues that she brings up. So I'm very happy to be able to introduce Dr. Nancy Hopkins, Professor Emerita at MIT. So thank
you. Okay, well, thank you so much, Jason. And let me get a little organized here. I think I'm organized, a lot of stuff, equipment here. Okay, here we go. Yeah. Several years ago, I decided that I would no longer lecture on this topic, having been asked to give well over 1,000 talks on it, literally. Several reasons. I'm 75 years old, and my own experiences in this field now qualify absolutely as history. There's no question about it. And the administrative work that I did at MIT that Jason talked about to advance the cause of women in science was between 1994 and 2010, roughly. And what we desperately need is new perspectives from people in the trenches. That would be you, okay? However, so why am I here? You might say, what is this woman doing here? She's quit, okay, she's retired, she's old. The Me Too movement is what brought me out. It's so invigorated the whole topic, I think, of women's status in all areas of society, including in science, that I came for selfish reasons and because of the meeting that Jason just mentioned at Banbury, okay? I'm just curious to see what's going on and to hear what young people think about this. And I'm so glad I came because this meeting that they just had was really extraordinary. And in fact, instead of listening to me today, what you ought to do is get Jason to come and report to you on this meeting we just had. It was really remarkable, and I hope that Jason and Carol Grider, who organized it, are going to write something up and it'll be published, or some way of finding out what went on there, because it was really, I think, a very unusual thing. Anyway, I really do think that this is a funny thing if you work on gender equity issues. It's got its highs and its incredible lows. It's very much like working on any other kind of thing like science, whatever. And sometimes you think, oh, great progress. And the next minute you think this is going absolutely nowhere. Oh my gosh. And really the goal of this is to get to a point where we never have to talk about this again, right? What we really want to do is get to a point where the problems that women have in science are exactly the same as the problems that men have in science. And all we have to do is talk about being a scientist and the issues that that involves. But we're not there yet. And so I thought what I'd do is give a brief history of how I came to be an advocate for women in STEM, some of the changes that I saw and participated in, the tremendous progress that I've seen, and the fact that despite so much progress, we aren't done yet, okay? Now, recently, I often hear people say, you know, young people say, there hasn't been any progress at all in this field. You see this written about. In fact, even the National Academy report that recently came out, oh, there hasn't been any progress at all, particularly in sexual health. This is not true, okay? Absolutely not true. There's been enormous progress in my lifetime. What I think contributes to the perception that there hasn't been progress is the fact that many, perhaps most of the obstacles that still exist for women in STEM fields are really the same ones that we dealt with in my generation 40 years ago. But they're much less intense, okay? And being much less intense turns out to make a big difference. So if I were to tell you some of the types of things that were said and thought in my generation, you would say, what? In fact, this was the fun of this meeting I just went to. I call them the younger generation, the kids who were there. You tell them these things and they just look at you as if you're crazy. I mean, you can't even believe that you're telling the truth, but it really has changed even when you're talking about the exact same issue. So progress is slow, but it is very real. And so your generation just has to keep going. The way I think about it, I like to think that completely solving this problem is going to take about the same amount of time as completely solving the cancer problem. So I don't know what you think, how long you think we could discuss. Is that 1 decade, 2 decades, 3? I'm not sure, but they seem to move around the same pace. So now I'm going to turn to some ancient history and then hope to convince you that there has really been a lot of progress. Okay, I'm going to read this pretty much because I have a lot to say. I want to make sure I get through it. I may digress and then I'll wander off into space and never come back. Okay, so when I went to college in 1960, there were essentially no women on the faculty of America's great research universities. The turning point was 1964, which was the year I graduated from college. The 1964 Civil Rights Act made it illegal to discriminate against women in hiring. But it turned out that even that was not enough to cause universities to hire women. So it took a women's liberation movement and affirmative action regulations in the early 1970s. And these laws pressured the universities to devise plans to hire women or risk losing their federal funding. Suddenly, more women were hired. I was one of them. I had done highly visible work in molecular biology as a graduate student at Harvard, and if I had applied for a job, I believe I would have been hired, actually. But it didn't occur to me to apply for a job, in fact. I was recruited by MIT and by Harvard Medical School. It wasn't at all unusual for universities to recruit men to their faculty, but it was new entirely to recruit women or even to let them in the door. So this slide shows what I've just said in graphic form. It shows the number of women faculty in the 6 departments of science at MIT as a function of time starting in 1960. The total number of faculty has remained essentially unchanged at about 270, so the shape of this curve is not a reflection of a change in the number of faculty. The 6 departments are biology, chemistry, math, physics, and so on. Before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, there were 0 women. So 1960, 0, okay? In those 6 departments. The first women arrived in the mid-1960s, so by 1970, there were 2 women, 2. Then, thanks to affirmative action, in just a few years, the number shot up tenfold to about 22 women. I was approximately female number 10 in this graph. And I'm going to return to the plateau and the other jumps in a moment. But the main point is, don't tell me there hasn't been any progress for women. We went from 0 to 22, right? And in the beginning, really, women couldn't be hired, and suddenly there you were. And what it took to do this was the civil rights movement, a women's movement, and affirmative action laws. So that just gives you some idea of what it takes to make social change happen. So when I joined the MIT faculty in 1973, I assumed that these very powerful legal remedies had completely removed any barriers that might have existed to women's advancement. When I'd been in college and later a graduate student at Harvard, I had, of course, noticed there weren't any women on the faculty. But I honestly thought there was only one reason. It seemed so obvious. The men who did the high-level science that I wanted to do worked 70 or more hours a week, and their wives worked longer hours. How could anyone possibly do both these jobs? There was no daycare, few, if any, family leave policies, no amniocentesis or reproductive technologies, So tremendous pressure on women to have children by the age of 30. So naturally, I assumed that apparently all women chose to be mothers rather than scientists. It did not occur to me that an occupation in which half the people on the face of the earth can't do the job and also have children is, by its structure, discriminatory. It's structured in a way that excludes half the population. So at the time I joined the MIT faculty in 1973, I'd just gotten divorced. I decided not to remarry, not to have children. Problem solved. That was very easy. Off I go to MIT. Not long after I got to MIT, I met a woman who had been hired to be an ombudsperson, and I learned from her that there were additional obstacles for women who aspired. I guess I should have said, so major obstacles, I'll keep a little list here. Major obstacles that slowed women's progress in STEM and solution. Step one, could not get a job. Solution, Civil Rights Act, affirmative action, and the women's movement. Step. So I met this woman, and she told me that there was an additional problem for women who wanted to be scientists. She said the most serious problem was sexual harassment. I had never heard of sexual harassment. The term did not even exist. I'd never heard it before she told me. She said it was derailing the careers of students and even faculty. She was very successful in that period, which was the early 70s, of getting these posters of naked women off the backs of doors in laboratories, of which there were many such pictures in those days. Okay, I'm talking about progress. That's progress. She was less successful at stopping professors from propositioning their students. Okay, but fortunately, in the 1980s, there was this visionary feminist lawyer named Catherine McKinnon, and she had the idea, the realization that if women were going to be sexually harassed, they weren't going to be able to work in the workplace in advance. So she was able to convince people that sexual harassment really was a form of discrimination, which had been made illegal already. So the idea was that under Title VII and Title IX of the Civil Rights Act, that you could make sexual harassment illegal. And that's what she succeeded in doing and got the courts to agree with her. And so that was the second big step that was taken. So once that happened, and MIT really had to deal with it, they appointed a faculty member, called him Associate Provost, and his job was to take on sexual harassment. And I've talked to him, and because this ombudsperson was not able to do it, they figured, so they had to hire somebody, because now it was illegal. And he said the hardest group of people to convince was the faculty. And the only thing that really changed their behavior was to tell them that if they did this, they were going to be sued. And so that was enormously effective, actually. And it changed behavior, apparently, of faculty and so forth. So I've been extremely surprised this year to learn from the National Academy Report and from many other stories in the news that sexual harassment is still so common in universities. I really have been stunned. Because I thought it had been dealt with very successfully at places like MIT by these laws. But apparently not. And one of the absolutely extraordinary things this week to me was a meeting that Jason and Carol organized, was to listen to the stories of young women who have experienced these and familiar with it, and to hear about the frequency and to hear from lawyers who deal with this. So I'd be very interested. I'm hoping to hear from you, because I have to say in my own career, it was never a problem that derailed me, but when it hits certain people in a certain way at a certain time of career, it can absolutely derail them and really pretty much ruin their life. So it's still with us, but I do think it's somewhat a lot better than it was in the beginning when there were these naked pictures around the laboratories. So already, I did not experience these things, so having gotten a job, having not had this experience of the sexual harassment to derail me, starting out, I totally believed that I was not going to experience anything called gender discrimination. It would not affect my professional life. I thought the only thing that stood between me and my Nobel Prize was working hard, doing good work, and a little bit of luck. I should say, at the time, I used to come to Cold Spring Harbor a lot as a student, and there was this wonderful woman here named Barbara McClintock. And she wanted to tell me about all the gender discrimination that existed in academia, and that if I went to MIT, I'd be miserable because I said, why is this person telling me this? It couldn't possibly. She said, no, that was solved by civil rights and affirmative action. There's no more gender discrimination. I really didn't know what this woman was talking about. So off I go to, be a happy, productive professor at MIT. Well, what happened? It took me 20 years to discover that I was wrong. Wrong then. To my extreme surprise, I discovered that gender discrimination did exist, even if you chose not to have children. And the way I figured it out, I came to understand it not first through my own experience, but by watching how other women were treated. From the start, I was having a difficult time, but I had many excuses and explanations for that. So I thought, but do any of these things happen to other women? So I began to look very carefully at how a man was valued and a woman was valued based on what I thought was the importance of the discoveries that they made, right? And over time, what I discovered was that if a man and woman made discoveries that, in my opinion, were equally important, the man was highly valued and the woman was kind of invisible. She might not be valued at all. She might not even get credit for this discovery. And the credit might even go to another person. And this was extremely hard for me to believe. In fact, it was so hard to believe and believe that it was true in what we believe is a meritocracy. There were so few women, so it was hard to do this comparative thing of how good is her science, how good is his science. So it took, of course, a long time. In fact, it took 15 years. But after 15, and I began to look not just at women at MIT, but women in my field outside of MIT. How were they doing? How were they perceived? How did the field look upon them? Were they as successful as Mr. X, Mr. Y? Now, after 15 years of this careful comparative observations, I was absolutely certain it was true. Now, the interesting thing is that through all of that, I still didn't think it was true of me. So I now realized after 15 years that all women's contributions were undervalued. But in my own case, I thought, no, it's still possible in my case that it's really my own fault, that I'm really not good enough, and what I ought to do is work harder and do a better experiment. Then everything will be fine. So it took another 5 years to realize, actually, no, that's not it. I really realized after that, by then it was 20 years, I think it was 20 years, that even if you made a Nobel Prize winning discovery, you still might not be recognized as being a scientist at that level. And I can't begin to tell you how disheartening that was. I mean, of course, most of us aren't going to win a Nobel Prize, but you know what I'm saying. The idea that no matter how hard you worked or how well you did, you'd sort of be invisible really undermines your desire to participate in the enterprise. It was absolutely devastating, and the worst of it was you couldn't tell anybody because first of all, who would believe you? And second of all, there was this belief, which I think is often still true, that if you complain, it's really because you aren't good enough. And even women themselves often believe that if they complain, people will just say, oh, well, she's really not good enough. She did a great experiment. Of course, we would credit her and so forth and so on. But by then I knew it was true. And in fact, not only that, I by then realized I'd made a Nobel Prize winning discovery right there because it was such a profound insight into how the world works and how our brains work. I thought, this is a Nobel Prize. P.S., this has won a Nobel Prize now by psychologists. So I was right. It was a Nobel Prize winning discovery. But unfortunately, I didn't know that, and I was unfortunately second to make the discovery. So what I decided to do was write to the president of MIT and ask him to help solve this problem. But before I sent my letter off, I thought, I should ask another woman scientist to read this letter and make sure that it's polite, clear, and forceful, so he'll know what I'm talking about. And this was also extremely hard to do because I thought, of course, this woman's going to think I'm a loser because I'm sure she hasn't figured this out. I'm the only person on earth who's figured this out. So it's very painful to admit to somebody else that you think you're being discriminated against. But I did, and I thought we all were, and I knew she was being discriminated against. I certainly didn't think she knew. I thought I was the only one who knew any of this. So I got up the courage to call her up and ask her if she'd like to have lunch. And I asked her if she'd read this letter and tell me if it was okay to send this to the president of MIT. And it was 1994. And as I say, I did not know about the literature. Today, I think most people do know the experiments that are done. Everybody familiar with this stuff now? I think so. Nobody. I'd never heard of it at the time that I was doing this. But everybody knows that if you have identical work and you put a man's name and woman's name on the same article, but Xerox copy of it, everybody thinks the work was better if they think it was done by a man, and both men and women will slightly overvalue the work if they think it was done by a man, and undervalue if they think it was done by a woman. Well, unfortunately, I didn't know that. It would have been super helpful if I had. Meanwhile, back at this little table sitting in Rebecca's Cafe in Kendall Square with my friend, she's reading my letter. She reads the letter very carefully, very slowly. I'm watching her to see if she thinks I'm some deadbeat loser. And she puts this thing down on the table when she finishes, and she says, you know, I agree with everything you've written here. In fact, I think we ought to go and see the president and talk to him about this problem. And I'm thinking, my heart is leaping. I'm joyous. I'm beyond happy. I can't even tell you. I think, my God, there's two of us who have figured this out. And not just that, but this woman was the first woman on the science faculty at MIT to be elected to the National Academy of Sciences. I thought, oh boy, MIT, you've got a problem. If it was just me, you know, you'd think, oh, that Hopkins, well, we don't care about what she thinks. Now you got two women, and one of them's a member of the National Academy. You have a problem. Okay. So I think you know, it's like a light bulb going off in your head, and I think I thought she might have had the same kind of thought. We looked at each other and said, you don't suppose there's more of us who have figured this out, do you? So we decided to go back and make a list of all the tenured women faculty in the School of Science, and then we would go and talk to them and see whether we could increase our numbers, because the more of us there were, the worse problem MIT had on its hands, right? So we did that, and that was when we were in for a bit of a shock. We made the discovery that in 1994, 30 years after the Civil Rights Act, there still were only 22 women on the faculty at MIT. And there were 15 tenured women, 197 tenured men, and there were 7 untenured women and 55 untenured men, so 22 total women. They comprised 8% of the science faculty. Over at Harvard at this time, so you might think, oh, it's MIT, what do you expect? A bunch of engineers, there's not many women. But over at Harvard at that time in the School of Science, they had 5% women. So this was a universal thing. It was not an MIT issue, it was a universal American issue. All universities, comparable universities, looked about the same. So I said to my colleague, well, it's not possible. I mean, come on, you know it's not possible there could be that few women. So at MIT, maybe they're listed separately. It's possible they list them in the back of the catalog or some different section. So we scoured the catalog, every field, every department, and we discovered 2 women in the School of Engineering who had joint appointments to the School of Science. So we thought, we'll add those to our list. That'll increase the statistical significance of anything we learn. So we had 17 women. Okay. So off we go. We divide the list in half, and we go off to talk to these people. We're in for the next shock. By the end of the day, we had managed to find 10 of them on campus. I'd find 5, she found 5, and they'd all figured it out. They all realized that there was something wrong with this picture about the way women were experiencing their careers at MIT. And they said, whatever you're writing, we'd like to sign on. So all of a sudden in a day, we had a movement. So that was the spring of 1994. So in the spring and summer of 1994, these 17 tenured women got together and talked, how do we solve this problem? What should we do? What's the best way to approach an institution and try to change it on an issue that they don't even know exists, okay? Now, it was so radical at that time for women to meet and talk about something like this that we were afraid to be seen going into a room together, because if people saw so many women, they would think, this is something wrong here, something terrible must be going on. So sometimes we met off campus, or we'd talk by telephone, whatever. And finally, we came up with the idea that we would write to the Dean of Science and ask him if he would set up a committee, instead of writing to the president, and 16 people decided to do this together, 16 of the 17, and they decided to write to the Dean of Science and ask him to set up a committee that could study this problem. And the Dean of Science at that time was a man named Bob Bergeneau, who would later go on and be the Chancellor of Berkeley, and he's still at Berkeley today. But he agreed to do this. Well, it's really hard to imagine, I think, back then, how revolutionary it was, again, for these people to do this. I mean, it was just a very difficult thing to do. Very scary. We thought our careers were over. The dean certainly thought his career would be over soon, and we thought ours might be too. Now, in fact, the dean said, yes, you can have your committee, you can go and study all this. But it turned out when he informed the department heads that the women were going to have this committee and they were going to look at data and they were going to look at equity issues and so forth, the department heads rebelled. They said, women with a committee looking at data? No, 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 this is a very bad idea. very dangerous. Who knows what could happen? So the dean had to step back. He came to my office one day, a very scary thing, standing in the door. When you see the dean of science coming to your office, you know trouble is on the horizon. Anyway, he came and he said, we're going to have to slow down, step back, and write a charge to the committee and engage the department heads in the writing so that they calm them down so they don't feel so worried that these women are too revolutionary, going to destroy MIT by having a committee to study this issue. So that's what we did. It took time. We had to have another committee, a pre-committee that wrote a charge to the real committee, and finally, after 6 months, the real committee was allowed to form in 1995. Then the dean wanted men on the committee. Men? I said, men on this women's committee? Are you kidding? I said, there's no men at MIT who understand this problem. We can't have men on the committee. He said, you have to have men. So I said, well, give us some powerful men. We don't want ordinary men, just give us powerful men. And so he gave us the 3 men who, one was the dean, one was the chairman of chemistry, and he was wonderful. One of them had been the chair of physics. He had a Nobel Prize, so he was a really nice guy. One had been the chair of math, and we called him the man from Planet Math. I think he had no concept. I think he was out there on another planet altogether. Anyway, the dean turned out to be absolutely right because, first of all, the women knew absolutely nothing. No woman had ever been chair of a department. We didn't know how anything worked. We didn't have access to data and so forth. So having these powerful men on the committee made it possible for us to access data, and they told us how the system's supposed to work, and they were able to understand that things were not working for us very quickly. So, and besides, I think, had the committee consisted only of women, then nobody would have believed what the findings were going to be. So it was a really brilliant idea by the dean to have those men on the committee. So I'm not going to talk about what we did. It's been the committee has been written up, but we met for a couple of years, and then the committee continued on after I stepped down after 2 years. Another person ran it. We collected data. We interviewed all the women. We documented how this unconscious undervaluation of women and their work has serious professional consequences. It can result in women not being hired, not being given equal resources for their research, and having different teaching and committee assignments, absent from powerful roles in the academic administration, lower salaries, less recognition, including prizes, you name it. We ran down through all these things and analyzed them for all these people, comparing against comparable individuals in their department. And the word that we finally used to describe what happened to these people was marginalization. So we learned that marginalization and exclusion from increased as women advanced in their careers. So these women were extremely successful scientists, but they had achieved their success by working all the time, working harder, working alone, raising all the money by themselves. They weren't tapped in to the fantastic resources that exist at a place like MIT. Another thing that was really important that the committee discovered was that each generation of young women had come into the system exactly like me, believing that gender discrimination had disappeared long and ever ago, and that it would never touch their lives, and that only the difficulty of having a family and being a woman would impact their careers. So MIT, I should say, had a family leave policy, we learned, but no woman had ever used it and gotten tenure. So only men used the family leave policy, and they used it to start companies, do more work, and so forth. Well, the women were afraid to use the policy because there was a belief that you couldn't really be a great scientist and have children. And so women they hid their pregnancies as long as they could. Only men took the family leave, as I said. So I just want to stop and point out that is a change. I mean, that really is a huge change. Well, we wrote a very long report, 150 pages, confidential. We gave it to the dean, and he immediately fixed all these documented inequities that he could, lab space, salary. And then he made an enormous effort to hire more women. He said, really, I think the answer to this problem is more women. This is a culture problem. The very male-dominated culture of MIT is perhaps behind this problem. So we're going to hire more women. So he went around to all the department heads. He said, give me the names of the best women in the field. And then he would hop on the airplane as he was traveling, and he would go and try to recruit these women to MIT. And that's what he did. So this jump here is what we call the Bob Birgeneau bump, I call it, the Birgeneau bump. And it's a direct result of Bob Birgeneau saying the answer to this problem is more women. So we have 3 major events: the Civil Rights Act, affirmative action laws, and Bob Birgeneau. that caused the increase in the number of women faculty at MIT. Okay. Well, if that had been the end of it, and we thought that was the end of it, we were thrilled. I mean, we couldn't believe the dean had heard us. We had our report. It was all documented. Everyone agreed that was a wonderful thing, those who knew about it, but only about 30 people knew about it. And the dean had fixed all these things. And there it would have ended. I should say, you might say, what happened here? Well, Bob Birgeneau left MIT right there. So that's what happened, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But the story of this, so time went on, and a couple of years later, a woman became the chair of the MIT faculty, and she asked me if I would write up the story I've just told you for the MIT faculty newsletter. So I did, and by God, the thing was covered on the front pages of the Boston Globe and the New York Times. And that changes everything. So I would say the power of the press cannot be underestimated when you're trying to deal with certain issues, but it's very unpredictable. The press can go either way. What happened was this ended up on the front pages of the New York Times and the Boston Globe. After you're on the front page of the New York Times, it's a very interesting thing happens. You go into your office and there are cameras lined up and down your halls of your office, outside your office, waiting for you. And I went in and there were all these things. The phone was ringing. I picked up the phone in my office and heard, "Good morning, you're hello." I said hello, and they said, "You're on the air in Australia," literally. So I was quite surprised by that. The next call came from the head of the MIT press spot saying, when you're on the front page of the New York Times, often there's a lot of attention and you're going to be speaking to a lot of press. So before you do that, you want to prepare yourself. You want to get your sound bites ready. I said, too late. Why didn't you call me at home this morning? Anyway, we soon learned that there had been really reports very much like this one that had been written by women, different universities, and they were buried and nothing ever happened to them. They didn't lead to the kinds of changes that this MIT report did. So why is that? The first thing was the president of MIT endorsed the report. President Vest did something which was extremely risky to do for his university and for his own career, I should add. What he wrote was these words which became sort of a quote that people use. Said, "I've always believed that contemporary gender discrimination is part perception, part reality. I learned that reality is the greater part of the balance." And that's really what made this report different. That, and I think another thing has made it different too, and that was, it came from MIT, so there was a lot of credibility. But it was also these individual women who I just can't say enough good things about. I mean, they're my dear friends, beloved colleagues to this day. If you look at those women, what happened to them? These women who had had difficult lives but were really extraordinary scientists. What you realize is that these were, exceptional scientists from the start. Of those 16 women who worked together to do this work, today 4 of them have won the United States National Medal of Science, and 11 of them are members of the National Academy of Sciences, and so forth. So these were people, if people at this level, I think, could have these kinds of negative experiences, that made it hard to say these women weren't good enough. You look like a raving idiot, right? So when the president of MIT saw what the public reaction was to all of this, he said, okay, we have to take this problem on now and fix it for all, we have to institutionally fix it. We have to fix it so it doesn't happen again. We have to change MIT. We've got to make this permanent. And this was another experience that I then had with MIT, and it was an absolutely remarkable thing. So how do you do that? How do you change an institution so these problems don't recur? What would you do if you were the president of MIT? So the first thing he did was to say all the parts of MIT, there are 5 schools of MIT, science, engineering, humanities, they all have to have a gender equity committee like the one that we had first in science. They have to collect the data, they have to make sure everything's equitable, they have to hire, look at the numbers of women, see what the pools are, so forth. Repeat what was done in science in all the schools of MIT. And he made a really serious commitment to do this. And then he did another thing too. So here, this shows the structure of MIT. This is how the institution works. This was the president who did this, President Chuck Vest, and we have a provost who is the most powerful academic officer at MIT. There was a chancellor who takes charge of undergraduate students. And then we have 5 deans, one each for the 5 schools, and under them would be the departments, so in science, the biology department and so forth. And here he established these 5 gender equity committees, one in each school, and then he created a committee which I chaired, co-chaired with the provost. And the idea, it was called a Council on Faculty Diversity. The idea was you take a person who really understands a problem well, and you partner them with the person who has the power to change an institution and rewrite policy, and that's the provost. And on that committee was the Dean of Science and the Dean of Engineering and the Chancellor. So we had the top leadership, the most powerful individuals at MIT were serving on this committee to examine this problem. And that represents a commitment which is gigantic. I mean, I'm sure you can imagine it here. If you put is faculty time is our really valuable resource, and the time of these people is hugely valuable. And if President Vest was in town and he was free, he would drop in on the meetings to participate as well. So this sent a really powerful message to people that the president was serious about this. He was not just, paying lip service to diversity. So at the time, he said, looking at the problems, he said, Nancy, any problem that I can measure, I know I can fix. What I don't know how to really fix is this thing called unconscious bias or marginalization. That I'm not sure, I don't know how to fix. And at that time I said, listen, if you just fix the things you can measure, I'm going to be in heaven. Please, just do that. We'll be happy. That's good enough for me. And really that's what they sort of did. So here are the problems that they worked on. The family issue, the fact that young women said it was too difficult to be a professor at MIT and have children, and they were afraid to take family leave because of the stigma, the unequal resources and rewards that could arise, the fact that there were no women in the academic administration, the small number of women faculty, and then this tough one of the underlying attitudes that really lead to many of these problems. So what do you do about these things? So what they did is they rewrote family leave policies, and they engaged with all the women at the university who were invited to come to the meetings. All the department heads, everybody participated and had ideas about how to write the best family leave policies for women trying to be faculty at MIT. Those policies were then taken past all the department heads by the deans, and then after consensus was reached, which took a long time, as you can imagine, many months, the final result was brought to the provost, to our committee, and where it could be turned into policy. So it was written into policy. And he built daycare on campus because that was the thing people said they needed. There was a huge building called the Status Center by Gary, the one with leaks all the time. Beautiful building, but it does leak all the time. Very fancy architect, that's the customary outcome. Anyway, that building was just being built, $400 million building, I think it was, some ridiculous amount. And they redesigned the first floor to include a huge daycare center. Suddenly, there were babies on campus. I mean, you talk about revolutionary, baby on campus. I mean, I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw this. So that was huge. Now there are several daycare centers and baby daycare centers. So they did that. And for the inequities, they had the women, you have to have the people who are affected involved in looking at the data. We reviewed data. And I was sitting on the top level of the administration at the highest level. I got to see the faculty salaries for all of MIT. And that's a very small committee, only 10 people or something on it ever get to see this data. So what we had through the structure was people at the bottom connected all the way up to the top through this committee system. And then they strongly recruited women into the academic administration, and of course, as department heads and so forth. And President Vest, when he stepped down, was followed by Susan Hockfield, a woman, which was something that, in my generation, it was not imaginable a woman could be the president of MIT or the president of Harvard, and of course, Princeton for that matter. And having women in powerful positions is enormously important. I'd say having babies on campus and women in powerful positions were the two really astonishing things to me, those from my generation, to see that happen. And what about the number of women faculty? So that's that slide. So the dean left, and we had not realized how you had to keep tracking this. You couldn't take your eyes off it for a minute. And a new, under Susan Hockfield and Dean Kastner and Associate Dean Hazel Siv took this problem on, and the numbers went up again by changing policies of making sure that everyone tracked the hiring, that everybody was engaged, and so forth. So collectively, I think it's fair to say that the changes that took place were certainly amazing for those of us of that generation. I mean, more than we couldn't have dreamed that this would happen. And it was an absolutely wonderful thing. I should say that over time, what happens, the gender equity committees, one of them still continued on for another 15 years. The other four gradually declined. People thought it's all solved, just a waste of our time. So, yeah. And then 2 years ago, some women decided we're backsliding, we have to start up again. So they've just started. And last week, I was in Cambridge and I went to the inaugural meeting of the new engineering committee. And it was just astonishing. Looking back to where we began from, where we were afraid that what we were doing was so radical that it could seriously negatively impact our careers. This meeting, it was half men, half women on the committee. The person running the meeting was a woman who's an associate dean of engineering at MIT, and everybody was engaged. And it's a standard academic work, committee work. So that was really exciting. I should say also that the committee that was formed in the School of Engineering, the person who chaired that committee, named Lorna Gibson, worked with a dean named Tom Magnani. And when Tom Magnani took this problem on the same way Bob Birgeneau did in science, he said, I'm just going to hire women. So what they accomplished is astonishing. Now, the number of women in the School of Engineering at MIT now is greater, slightly higher, the same as the School of Science, and higher than probably most places in the United States. And it came about because of this commitment made at that same time, and also they changed the culture. And so I asked these, how did it happen that you were able to do this and sustain it, to keep the numbers going up? And it turns out that what people tell you is the women that they hired were so good that the men in engineering say, well, where were these women hiding all these years? Why didn't we have them on our faculty before? Why didn't you hire these women sooner? So I'd say the School of Engineering has actually been the star of the show. Okay, so you'd say, that's a great story. Why are we here? Why are we still talking about this? Done, it's all fixed. Well, we know it isn't fixed. How do we know that? Partly because the National Academy report tells us so, partly because we just know it's true. I would say, oh, I forgot. I had a piece. I'm sorry, I got to do this one. These were the problems that were remaining in the family work. We took care of that. Sexual harassment, we never dealt with. The topic never came up. Not one woman faculty member ever raised this topic at any meeting that we had. So we didn't study it. Small numbers was the next one I was going to talk about. What about the small numbers? If you look at the numbers of women on the faculty, what we know now for the past, say, 15 years or so, at least, I think, certainly decade, but I think it's 15 years now, the percent of women who are hired in both the School of Science and the School of Engineering equals the percent of women in the applicant pools to those things. In fact, in engineering, they've hired really above the applicant pool considerably. And so you have to ask the question, okay, well, if you're doing such a great job, how come the number of women faculty is still so low? Okay, because it's only 18% of the faculty in science and 19% in the School of Engineering. It turns out there's two reasons. And I see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up here, because you probably all know about this anyway. But anyway, it's kind of interesting to look at a lot of data. But it turns out there's two reasons. In half the departments, the pipeline is still very small. So the percent of women getting PhDs in that field is really low. And in the other half of so this shows you things like physics or aeroastro, electrical computer science. I marked all the ones that are 20% or fewer of the PhDs coming out of those same departments at MIT are women. So that's one reason that that's low. And the other reason is in the other half of the departments, some of them where the numbers of women are higher, the pipeline leaks by about half. So the question is why, and I'm sure here everybody knows, I don't really have to include this in my talk. For most of the cases, we don't know. And the only really important discovery that was made by Jason and Joan for the biology department, and they discovered that this extraordinary thing, which is that if you look at why does it leak between PhD and faculty, the main leak is between not between PhD to postdoc and postdoc to faculty. It's the particular labs that people do their postdoc in, and those are the labs that feed the junior faculty of the biology departments. So that's a major discovery that we know, and it's the only case in which we do understand it very well, I think, but we don't know why it happens. So bottom line on numbers of why the numbers low requires conscious attention and effort over decades. Requires decades because the turnover of faculty is so slow. So you have to take this on and stick with it for a long time. And even though we now hire at the rate of the applicant pools, it's still low for the two reasons that I just mentioned. So how would you change that? You'd almost have to go back and look at the pipeline before the PhD, back into K-12, and also study why it leaks for these fields other than thing. So now we're down to the problems, back to the problems. So all those things, I think, sort of the reasons, and then the question is, why does the pipeline look like that? And I've done that work. So where are we today? If we look at those problems there, I think that in terms of what are the problems, in terms of the family work problem, despite these new rules, despite the fact that all the junior women who come to MIT now have children, unlike my generation, they have children, they do the job, they get tenure at the same rate as men. So clearly, there's been a big impact of these changes. But for myself, I have to say, I still think it's too hard. I think we haven't made enough changes, and I think that is something that your generation has to complete. You have to step up and say, what is it we need to make this easier so more people will find this not only doable, but desirable. You know, it's still pretty hard to do. So that's one thing. The sexual harassment, as I say, I didn't really even know it was such a serious problem until the NAS report came out in the meeting that I just went to, and the small number of women faculty we talked about. So then we come to this last remaining problem, the one that Chuck Vest said, I don't know how to fix unconscious bias. I know how to fix things I can measure, but I don't know how to fix that. So what do we know about unconscious bias? And I think in some ways, what we did is the way you address it. We know it causes things like inequity, so you have to go in, get the data, and fix. That's the good solution to the problem, unfortunately. But what about unconscious bias? Does it affect things, and what happens if you don't go and fix the things? So I thought I would give an example that I find kind of stunning of what I think is like the kinds of problems I've been telling you about that we had at MIT and addressed in the mechanisms that I just told you. And that problem is the biotechnology startup industry. And this is something that I also think affects your generation and that I think is really important, particularly here, and particularly because New York is trying to promote biotech now, and it's going to be a major industry here as it is in Boston, where I live. And so this is something I think is worth thinking about. So this slide shows the biology pipeline again at MIT in the year 2011. 70% of undergraduate majors at MIT are women. 50% of the PhD students, postdocs, and the faculty in biology, the faculty in brain and cog. And then there's this funny thing here. So what's that? In 2011, a woman who worked at Harvard Business School came to see me because of a funny thing. She had seen a piece of paper on which there was listed 100 scientists in the Boston area who had been funded to start biotech companies. How many of those 100 people do you think were women? There was one. One, and she said, can you explain this to me? I said, well, not really. That's a tough question. But I was giving a talk for my retirement dinner that had been organized by the Senate administration, and I thought, okay, I want to thank these people for all the great work they did and tell them you've got more work to do. So I gave them all this wonderful stuff, but what's this? So I said, you know, unconscious bias, if you don't monitor some activity, you can still get these really odd things where women are left out. So I slapped this on there. So it happened that there was a woman in the audience who was a member of the corporation at MIT. And she was very interested in this number because she's actually in business. She wanted to know, 1%, what the heck's that? So I explained, you know, she started to call me up. She said, I'm very concerned about that 1%. What are you going to do about it? And I said, I'm going to retire. And that I'm going to leave that to another bunch of people to work on because I'm out of here. Okay. So she was so persistent And it was so, ultimately irritating that I actually love this woman. I got to be really close friends with her, I adore her. But just to get her off my back, I decided I would collect some data to make her happy. And what I was interested in was only this startup phase of the biotech industry. So I don't know how much you know about the industry, but companies are started by faculty, university faculty, who make a discovery, patent it, they get intellectual property through MIT, and then with venture capitalists come and look for interesting things that could make a company, and they form a company. And the founders then are one or two faculty, often with the postdoc who made the discovery in the lab, and they get together and start the company, and then they invite people to be on the board of directors, which are the people who are going to run sort of this startup phase, and you have a scientific advisory board who are other scientists who work in that area. And this is before the company goes public, okay? So these are startup companies. So I go to the web. What I did is I imagined the halls of MIT. I'm picturing the faculty, and I'm typing in the name of the person, and then I'm going to the web and seeing what companies they might have started, and going to look and see who are the founders of these companies, who are the BOD and SAB members. And I started with Eric Lander for the reason that all the time in the Boston Globe, I was reading about the companies he was starting, so it was very easy. I didn't have to work hard to find the companies. I could just go right to them. And so here's Eric Lander, 3 companies founded by Eric Lander. And I saw that, so one was Millennium, and that's quite a long time ago. Then there's Foundation Medicine, which is based on sequencing cancer genomes. And then there was this company called Veristem. And that one is a stem cell, it's really cancer stem cells, but it's a stem cell company. And I looked at it, and there wasn't a single woman scientist on any of these things. And I thought that was kind of odd. Are there no women work in stem cells? I mean, really none? So I go to the web to look up stem cell experts. I didn't look up cancer stem cell experts. I figured stem cells, okay. So I go to the web to see if there are any women who are good enough to be members of this company. And I find that according to the web, the top 111 scientists who are stem cell experts, 24% of the leading people are women. 2 of them are professors at MIT, women, but they are not part of this company. And only one of the men who is part of this company is considered a world expert. So I discovered expertise may not be the only factor involved in whether you're involved in this particular company, nor was age or having a Nobel Prize, because one of the founders was actually the postdoc who had done the work, who was then being recruited to our faculty that year. So I continued on doing this for other faculty up and down the halls of MIT, up and down the halls of Harvard, Harvard Medical School, Sloan Kettering, West Coast, whatever. And here's a summary of data just for the first 18 companies I looked at on the East Coast. What was interesting was it wasn't just faculty who stayed within the university where women were not participating in these companies, but if you looked at who are these other people? They come out of industry, they come out of biotech, and they've risen to be at the tops of these startup phase. You discovered women weren't rising through biotech, they weren't rising through pharma, whatever. But I didn't care about that. I was interested by it, but I was really interested in the faculty involvement. And so what I found was, for these 18 companies, 223 men, 8 women, of the 84 people who remained full-time faculty, only there were 80 men and 4 women. So it was it was better than the 1% that had been told by the woman at Harvard Business School, but it wasn't that much better. So what that made me understand is that while MIT was working very hard and putting millions of dollars into diversifying its faculty, to engaging women, to making sure that they were having a great experience on the campus, the men just went off the campus and did this other activity in which the women were not participating. We actually thought, well, maybe women really don't want to participate, so we called them all up and asked if they'd been asked to participate, and none had been asked. We tried to find out if they had founded companies, and we found only one woman in the School of Science who had founded a company. So that was disheartening. This is a picture that shows that the orange buildings are the Broad Institute and the Whitehead Institute, and 2 of the yellow buildings are the Biology Department and the Koch Institute. The red buildings are biotech companies around MIT. The blue ones are tech companies around MIT. So you see, we're surrounded now by this industry. So this is very concerning because, of course, it's now become such a part of our profession, and I think it's an issue that we have to take on now, because a lot of people want to go into biotech. We have to understand why is this happening and try to fix it or address it if we can. So that's what I'll be doing next week. Okay. I'm retired, but that will be my last project, I promise you. Anyway, so what do I think about all this? A lot of progress. Anything that can be measured, you can fix if you've got the commitment from your university or institution to do so. But changing the underlying biases is going to take time. So how do you do it? How do you keep doing this kind of work? The most important thing we always said at MIT, Chuck Vest and Bob Brown and Bob Birgeneau, and we all felt that what people used to say, oh, time alone is going to fix this problem. What we found out was, no, lesson one, time alone doesn't fix a damn thing. It's people who fix things. You have to go in and do something. They don't just change because time passes, okay? So how would you consider that you would reduce or eliminate unconscious bias? What would you do about this? Chuck Vest couldn't figure it out. He was pretty good, but hey, here's your opportunity. Well, I asked one of the great psychologists of her generation, which is Liz Spelke. I don't know if you know her work at Harvard. I said, how do you really change this? And here is her answer. She said, change the world, and the biases will change along with it. But these biases come from seeing the world a certain way, believing that's the way it is, and buying right into that as an infant, in fact. And so all you have to do is keep doing this kind of work until things have been made equitable and everybody's fully engaged and it's diverse and we never think about these issues anymore and everybody will think, oh, you mean it wasn't always that way? So that's my charge to you. Thank you very much.